and I'm an OCD Massachusetts board member. Welcome to the Les Grodberg Memorial OCD Lecture Series. Tonight, Dr. Jason Elias is going to be talking about the poop group. Dr. Jason Elias is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in the treatment of obsessive-compulsive disorder and other anxiety disorders. He's currently Director of Psychological Services and Clinical Research at the Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder Institute at McLean Hospital. He's also an instructor in psychology for Harvard Medical School, providing supervision for psychiatry residents and psychology interns in cognitive therapy. Dr. Elias maintains a private practice in Belmont, Massachusetts, where he provides individual therapy for people with anxiety disorders.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
I feel kind of important after that introduction. So thanks for coming tonight. I wanted to say, especially if you have a small group, I should take questions throughout. If you have a question, just raise your hand. And I'll try to be mindful of the time, because I know that given the topic, there are always people that want to ask questions afterward in a little bit less public format. So I'll try to end a little early so you can do that. I don't mind staying late, but we will have to leave and make sure that we make room for the next group. So, I think it's amazing that on election day, we're having this group and then you guys can hang out because there's a lot of excitement. And I was thinking how, just when you thought all those commercials about the candidates would be over and all the poop in your lives was going to finally sort of vanish. You have a group tonight that's all about more poop. So, I have some disclaimers that I want to go over first. So first, there are some risks associated with attending a talk about poop. First being some unpleasant mental images, perhaps. As we talk about poop, you really can't do that without having some of those. There also might be some gross or awkward experiences that we have tonight, because we're really taught not to talk about poop. Or if you do, it's usually in a sort of in a funny way, but we'll do both. We'll joke around a little bit, but we'll be talking pretty candidly about the process. And I usually do quite a bit of self-disclosure to sort of lead the way to make that okay for people. So, so that's just inherently part of a talk like this. Third is that it may be anxiety-provoking for some or all of you for various reasons, because of the social sort of norms that we're going to be breaking by talking about this stuff, and if you're willing to share some things. And also, if you have OCD about contamination or poop, it might be triggering to you in some way, but it's not intended to be anxiety-provoking. It's just one of those things that might be. So I have to throw that out there, that we aren't going to avoid stuff tonight, because we have to talk about it if you want to learn about it, but just to be aware that that's part of this too. And fourth, and maybe one of the most important things, is that the things that I say tonight, I know at some points might sound like it could be interpreted anyway as me making fun of these things. And that's really not how I intended at all. It is to make light of certain things and to sort of have fun with the topic. But the reason why I'm doing the lecture, the reason why we have the group at the OCDI is actually called Bathroom Habits, because it encompasses more than just poop. We spend a lot of time on bowel movements and bathroom usage. And the reason that group exists is that this is such a big problem in our society, not just for people who have OCD, but in general, that you're taught how to poop and how to wipe yourself and how to do all those things when you're, how old? Like 3, maybe? Toilet training starts pretty young. And by the time you get to kindergarten, usually it's a requirement that you're able to do that on your own with almost no assistance. So let's say around the age of 5-ish, but you're kind of totally independent when it comes to pooping. But then think about how much life has transpired between 5 years old and now, and how little opportunity you've had to observe other people pooping and to sort of figure out what makes sense to do in there, compared to washing your hands or shaving or even showering or some other things that might be part of bathroom habits or routines. Usually you get to observe them in some way, right? But pooping is almost always private, behind closed doors, and it may not be something that you have a lot of sort of data from other people's experiences to measure your experience against. So some of the stuff we talked about will be about OCD and might really be about things that you specifically have had trouble with related to that. But you might learn some things that just help you in general with pooping, even if that hasn't been sort of an OCD symptom for you. So that's sort of to my next point, is that some of this info may or may not apply to you. So take everything with a grain of salt, ask a question, if you need clarification. And last is to be respectful of each other's privacy. This is a rule that we have, or a policy that we have for the group that I run at OCDI, where I remind people that it's great if you can share as much as you want to about your own experience. When we leave the group, we just say, don't share any of the things you've heard other people talk about outside the group. You can always share your experience with people, but we don't want you to share other things people have talked about, because we want people to be willing to share in the group. Okay, so these are some of the basic facts of life. These are things that you really have to do to stay alive. You have to eat and drink, you have to breathe, you have to sleep, and you have to poop and pee. You can't really get around this. And you know, it occurred to me, again, because there's maybe it's one of those unpleasant or awkward images that might come to mind. I was wondering who's going to use the bathroom first after this election. The guy who finds out that he is going to be president, or the guy who finds out that he is not going to be president? Because I could really see it other way. Either way, I could see feeling sort of like a sigh of relief in a way that you're not going to be, you don't have this huge responsibility bestowed upon you, and that the guy that wins might suddenly have a little abdominal distress, you know. But either way, both men have a Secret Service appointment now, and their families as well. So I wonder what pooping is like for these guys. Honestly. Like, there might be a Secret Service detail waiting outside the door now when they poop a lot of the time. Which sort of brings us to this thing, like, we all have to do this. There's a famous or semi-famous children's book called Everybody Poops. It's supposed to like teach kids and get them interested in doing it on their own. But we forget that both of these guys are wearing suits today, meeting all these people, and at some point, assuming, well, maybe not. Depends on their cycle, right? What's regular for them. But in the last week, they've both pooped at some point during this process, and then gone on to some like really important meeting or a speech or something like that. And then in the office of the president, in the midst of crazy crises and conflicts and all this stuff, there's still a moment where you've got to go poop. So it's kind of humbling in a way to think, it doesn't matter how powerful you are, how important you are in life, this is something you have to do. And really the goal in the group is to try to have this be like a respite, a break from the day, or something that's sort of relaxing and not something that's the source of stress or constant worry. These things should be sort of a restorative thing in a way. So part of the reason pooing becomes, this is sort of my theory, about why pooing becomes a problem in OCD, is that it's a mix of automatic and strategic processes. So what this means is that there's certain functions of your body you don't have control over, which is the automatic part. And so if you're worried about, for some people it's losing control of your bowels and having diarrhea. So being out in public is really risky because you don't have total control. Or it's, well, you'll be able to get clean enough, and when will I know if I'm done? Sort of these other things like that that might bother someone with OCD. And then there's just the strategic part, like, even though I already said, like, you have to poop and pee, right? You can't survive without doing those things. It's a little different than sleep and eating. What was the other one I could? Oh, and breathing. Because if you try to stop these first three, your body takes over, right? If you try to stop breathing, what happens?
You pass out and die.
But you don't. Well, you pass out. Sure. And then your body starts breathing again even before you've regained consciousness.
Yeah.
Right? So it sort of commandeers you and says like, look, idiot, we have to breathe. So I'm knocking you out and we're going to breathe again. If you try to stop eating and drinking, what happens? You could definitely starve yourself to death. But before you starve to death, your body will start digesting you. It will start accessing fat reserves. Eventually it starts accessing muscle. And so people that go a long period of time with these eating disorders can have heart problems and other things because the muscles get weak and deteriorate from having other things. So your body, even when you stop eating, your body doesn't stop eating. Right? It keeps going. Same thing with sleep. If you try to stop this, your body goes into micro sleeps. So you're kind of shut down for these brief moments. So all these things kind of have an override. This one, also has an override, but it's a little different. You can actually stop pooping at least for a long time. You could go weeks and weeks without pooping. And so it's something that feels like maybe you have control over it, or that you should have control, or that you can manipulate the system. But really what you get from doing that usually is it just makes whatever the problem is you're worried about, it tends to make it worse because you get out of rhythm. And we'll talk more about specifics about that. And remember, just ask me questions as we go. Yeah. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this stuff already. I jumped in a little. So let's go into some of the normative information about bathroom routines. Oh, and I forgot to ask, how many of you have seen or heard this talk before? No. Because I don't want to repeat everything, but you might hear it a different way. So let's talk about how often you're supposed to poop. What do you think? How often did the candidates poop this week?
Depends on how much you eat and when you eat, right?
That could be a factor. Yeah, eating stimulates pooping. There's actually a medical term for that called postprandial pooping. Like after you have a meal, it stimulates the bowels to go. So it's a good time to go actually. Have the urge. Well, what are some guesses?
Once a day.
Once a day?
Maybe less more.
Maybe less more. It ends up being sort of this very wide range of 2 to 3 times a day or 2 to 3 times a week. And any of that is normal. It's sort of knowing what your baseline is. So if you went to somebody, I'm not a real doctor, I'm a psychologist, so I play fast and loose with the medical stuff during this talk. Check my facts with the medical doctor. But if you talk to somebody who knows about poop, they wouldn't be worried if you said, I only poop twice a week. Isn't that really bad? I have a friend who goes twice a day. They should ask you, well, what's normal for you? What's typical? So that's the way you've always been. That's probably normal. Nothing to worry about. If there's a sudden change, then it might be because you change your diet or some medications. Constipation, for example, or there might be something to kind of help you explain it, but anything in that range is normal. So then, what is it like? In terms of color, shape, texture, smell, density, these kinds of things. So we talked about this. Whoops. Where is it? Okay. So yes, this is the thing about what is it like. So the color of your poop depends a lot on what you eat. So your poop is your food, basically. So if you're anywhere in this range, green, yellowish, brown, yellowish, brown to brown, or reddish, that all can be very normal. And if you go back to thinking, well, what did I eat? And it sort of matches, and that makes sense. So things like food colorings, stuff like that can change the color and sort of cause you to worry, but if you know that you just had a birthday cake with blue icing, there's a blue tint to the water, you kind of go, okay, put 2 and 2 together. So it's a very logical thing, but we don't always think that way, especially if poop is the source of some anxiety, right? We tend to think about things and lose sight of that. So here are some things that actually are maybe something that's worth checking out, right? So if your poop is bright red, probably is, unless you've been eating beets or red jello or something like that, it could be that you have some bleeding and it's probably near the outside of your body or on the outside of your body, so it's probably nothing to worry too much about. depending on how much blood there is. So if you have a hemorrhoid that's ruptured, you might have a lot of blood, and so you would know that, and you think, oh, I should probably go to the doctor. But if there's a little blood, it's probably from excessive wiping or maybe some internal hemorrhoids or something. It's not that big of a deal. Black, sort of tar-like poop is more consistent with bleeding that's a little bit higher up in the system. So if you think about the blood has had a chance to coagulate, and then normally it would form a scab if it had had contact with the air, but since it's inside, it doesn't really do that. It just gets very thick and like tarry. So that would be something that could be a little more serious if you want to get checked out, because it could be an internal bleeding of some kind. If you've been avoiding pooping for a long time, you're sort of creating a situation where the poop is dehydrated and you can have a little bit of trouble. But there are sometimes when it's black for very harmless reasons, like if you take iron pills, that can change the color. If you take Pepto-Bismol, it can change the color. And I'm sure that if you really have a love for black licorice, it might be a little more black too. So food also still plays a role there. And then the last one is this sort of whitish, gray, floating poop that smells really, really bad. The whitish gray can be a symptom of fats that aren't being properly digested or taken care of by the liver. And so, again, that's like something that if you notice a change and it's looking like this, then you just go to your doctor and also check it out. This is one of the coolest charts that I found online because it looks very official. It's like an official medical chart of poop, but I've never had anyone show this to me and say, during a physical, like, what are your poops like? And I've even been to a gastroenterologist and had a colonoscopy for IBS. They didn't show me this chart. They asked me about it and had to bring samples, but they would have rather just pointed to the picture. So we have here at the top, this is sort of like the most dry and sort of constipated food, all the way down to very watery, right, without much of a form at all. And this one is the ideal if we have such a thing. You may not have thought about it being an ideal poop. Or some people with OCD kind of like these poops the best because they are hard and compact, and it seems cleaner because everything is like, hard. But this one is actually the one that you want. This comes out all one piece. You see how it has that nice curve, which means that it's soft enough that it's following the natural curve of your colon. This one and this one, they're so straight that they have to go through those bends and curves like this, which causes abdominal distress and can cause some of that bleeding that I talked about earlier. And it makes it harder to have a bowel movement when it's like this. Now, it's not your fault if it's like this. It could be that your medications are causing constipation, but there's stuff you probably could do to help yourself out by drinking more water and eating different kinds of things. So this one is the one that we really think of sort of like ideal food. When am I done question. This is a when the tree falls in the forest type question. When are you done cooking? Because the moment you take a bite of food, you're starting to create more food. Right? So in a way, I think of the cycle as just, it's always happening, always happening. So I've had some experience with patients that are really preoccupied with this question. They want to be completely done, and they'll sit so long on the toilet that they eventually have a little more to expel. And sometimes it's not even poop. Sometimes it's like just fluids from the GI tract. But if you really focus too hard on this question, you'll never get to the end of it because it's a continual process. It feels like a discrete thing, like I go and I poop, we said 2 times a day or 2 times a week or something. But your body's always doing this. So if you think of it that way from the start, it kind of maybe helps loosen things up about your thinking anyway. So when you're in the bathroom, this is sort of like some strategies that we'll talk about tonight. These aren't strategies to help you ritualize better, they're meant to help you have better bowel movements so that you don't need to ritualize as much. do? That's the first question. How many of you push when you're in there? At least some of the time. How many of you try to avoid pushing? Maybe sometimes. Yeah, it's a good guideline, not to push too hard, but it's hard to know what that is. So, an example that I've used with some people that have this sort of like not sure how hard or too hard and all that. So I might ask them to read something aloud while having a bowel movement, so that if you are flexing your muscles, like I'm flexing my abdominal muscles right now, and pushing down, and I can talk to you normal. But if I'm really trying to increase the pressure, you have a harder time doing it. So that's sort of the guideline. Because eventually you do need to push, especially if you have some constipation. There's a little pushing that goes with it, but it really shouldn't be excessive. If you've ever noticed little red dots under your eyes or in your eyes, then you're definitely pushing too hard. You're breaking some blood vessels. The wiping, I have a good demo for this. What's your strategy? Have you thought about your strategy when it comes to wiping? I'm sure most of you know. We've all had strategy. After all, I told you I got into this partly because if someone told me about their wiping habits, say if we're talking about OCD, and they say, yeah, I'm worried, I spend a lot of time in the bathroom, I use a lot of toilet paper, and ask them questions about how they wipe, and they say something that sounds different than what I do, my natural assumption was, oh, that must be part of their OCD. Just not even thinking that, oh, these things vary, and who knows what the right way is to do this. So I really stopped assuming a lot about what's normal, what's OCD in the bathroom, and just sort of let people tell me what do they do in there, what's the most stressful part, how does it interfere, kind of get away from all this stuff. I used to do the worst thing in the world for my system when I was in graduate school. I was always very anxious in the mornings, which was sort of now in my life that's just kind of gives me energy to do what I need to do for the day, but I would have no appetite. So I'd wake up, I'd eat nothing, and I would drink coffee. And so between the coffee and the stress and having eaten nothing, my system was all out of whack, and I could have 3 bowel movements before 9 o'clock. So at first, I did what I think a lot of people do. I started thinking, what am I eating? What can I do? And I'm like, if I had a good poop, I'd be like, what did I eat? Try to repeat that. And figure out, oh, so maybe I can recreate this thing. Instead of using more like common sense and think, I need to get on a more consistent routine somehow to change this. And eventually went to the doctor and really helped me kind of go, duh, figure this out. But it took a while. And none of it was really OCD related. It was just my system and trying to figure it out. So then if you add to that uncertainty around the process or fear of contamination and all these other things, it's easy to think you get off track. So what are some of the strategies you guys have for wiping? Or what have you, maybe we can talk about what have you heard people do so you don't have to self-disclose unnecessarily.
I can talk about teaching children.
Sure.
It seems like it work better with children to not go too good and go around.
Oh, good. Get right into the nitty-gritty. Right. So you could wipe like this, or you do this, is what you're saying. You go around, right? So think about yourself. Okay, do I go between or do I go around? And are you a folder or are you a crumpler when it comes to type of, how do you use the toilet paper? And are you someone that wipes one time and then you toss it, or do you do this? You toss it. Do you stand up when you wipe, or do you stay seated? These are all things that are normal. People just have their own style of doing it. So I used to think if someone stood up, that must be OCD, because I sit down when I wipe. And I thought, oh, they don't want to be near the poop, and so it don't make sense. So I might ask somebody to try to sit while they wipe, which would be like asking me to do it with my left hand for no good reason. right? I'm a righty, so I use my right hand, but if somebody was a lefty, they go, oh, there must be OCDs, right? It doesn't make sense to do that. So it doesn't make sense, again, to assume that what you're doing is OCD, but to just take a look at the whole thing and see what's functional or not. Okay, so whether you go between your legs or around or a folder or crumpler, we're not going to assume any of that's OCD yet. That's all perfectly fine. What is your plan of attack? What's your goal when you go in for the first wipe? If you've never thought about that, this is your chance.
You gotta see how bad it is.
You see what the damage is?
Yeah.
All right. How do you go about assessing that damage?
You start wiping and see what happens.
All right, so you wipe and you look, and then you go. Now, have you thought about the first wipe? Do you have different strategies? Depending on what kind of a day it is, what kind of a poop it is? Or do you just kind of go in there? Maybe you haven't thought about it. I have a demo. That might help. Okay. Poop guy has to have a demo. Alright, so let's assume that this bite of sandwich is your poop. It might as well be, right? Because it will eventually turn into my poop. I'm going to use this because it's white and it's going to help demonstrate this more clearly. We'll say that this is the like outside of my bum, right? My rectum, my anus. This is it, okay? So I have a poop, and you know it's just my luck that it's not one of those perfectly clean poops. I can tell that it's kind of a messy bowel movement. That used to be like an excuse that many people would give me. But I have messy bowel movements. That's why I need to use a whole roll of toilet paper. So we're going to take, you know, this is the worst case scenario. It's a messy bowel movement, and it's out, you know, you have to sort of turn this upside down in your mind. It's now I've got some of the matter on the outside. Right? We're mammals, so we're hairy, and so things stick to us, and this little piece of poop that's now on my bum. If I really, really want to get clean, if I'm worried about getting clean, doesn't it sometimes, maybe not always, but doesn't it feel like this is what you want to do? Like really get in there and really like attack the problem, survey the damage, right? Like, wow, it really is messy, and now you've got this to clean up, right? So then you got to go, you grab another, whatever, and you just keep going and going and going. And this thing is going to be difficult to clean. So, it's like the magic of television. You have a clean anus now. Ready for wiping. So, let's take the scenario again. We have the poop again. I'll even use this used piece of toilet paper. Suppose on the very first wipe, you took a different approach, and instead of attacking the problem with brute force, you take a very, very gentle approach, like one where you barely would feel the toilet paper kind of grazing your skin. You wonder if you'd actually make contact. But look at what would happen if you did that. Oops. Right? It does. It's much easier to move this thing around. I mean, this isn't a real piece of poop, but it's going to stick. See how that happens? It's going to stick to the paper. If this was such a big chunk of sandwich, it would probably lift, yeah, like right off. See? Because I'm not putting the pressure against my body. I'm kind of just gently pulling it apart. And this stuff, after all, if it's sticking to you, that means it's sticky, right? It'll stick to other stuff. But I'll tell you, this. Sometimes I would think, well, what am I doing by teaching people this trick? Am I saying this is the right way? If you do it this way, you won't be as dirty, and it's sort of like an avoidance thing, which you know is not good for OCD. But it's not. This is just something that you've never been taught, and it took me like 3 years to figure it out by working with patients and thinking about this more strategically and really putting some effort into it. This is going to make all of the wipes after the first one much easier. You can do the first 2 or 3 wipes with this approach, this nice sort or gentle wipe, and it's going to make it much, much easier. So we'll actually have fewer rituals to do. The wiping to get clean will be easier. And if it's not something that's usually, like wiping this way that I'm describing, it's usually more anxiety provoking for people. So I'm not telling you something that's easier to do. It's actually harder to do because when you do the wipe in this light way, now we're getting into that uncertainty sphere that OCD is all about, where it's like, I don't know if I'm making contact, I don't know what I'm making contact with, and it just feels not right. I'd much rather kind of know where I am and really do this, or for some people they get to the point where they're wrapping toilet paper around their fingers like this, so they really have a lot of control, and then they can also sort of wipe on the inside as well as the outside, and again, like, now you're dragging whatever's inside outside, which complicates things. So it's like everything you might be thinking about how to do a good job of wiping might be just making it more difficult for you. And it also increases the pressure on your backside, which leads to internal hemorrhoids, and those constrict your anus a little bit, make it harder to have a bowel movement without it being messy. There, the cycle starts to get worse and worse. So you have questions about the demo at this point? Does it make sense? Well, I'm lucky that we have Christina here because she's helped me with the group before. So I thought we could play sort of this game of telephone with the toilet paper. If you're not a folder, you'll just have to bear with us here. Christina is going to show you. You hold your hands out like this, okay? She's going to show you what the sort of proper pressure would be to use this technique. And then once you, so Sean, you'll be the first, and then you'll pass it on and pass it on. And we'll go around and we'll see what it feels like when it comes back. Okay? So you'll get a chance to feel it and then to practice it. It's almost like butterfly kisses. Yeah. It could even be a little harder than that. It doesn't have to be, it's good that you're kind of practicing the extreme, but much, much softer than what you're doing. Okay, so something else to consider. It's a really good strategy, but
Actually, turn your hand away.
I'll just let it finish. This is like a communal pooping experience. How many times can you say that you've had something like this? Perfect. That's great. Okay. So another great strategy that you would need to talk with your doctor about for sure is whether or not to use a fiber supplement, something like Metamucil. There are a lot of them on the market. The issue here is that this kind of fiber supplement is natural. It's not like X-Lax. So people worry, oh, if I take Metamucil, I'm going to have like uncontrollable bowel movements. That's really not how it is. But if you take something like Metamucil at the wrong time, like if you say you take your meds every morning at 8 a.m. and then you take Metamucil, the meds will pass through your system without being absorbed, or they'll be absorbed less because it will kind of go through more quickly. And so I think on the bottle it says something like, you know, take this 2 hours after you've taken any medications. But you also should just talk with your doctor and see, is this something that would be good for me to try or not? And they'll probably tell you yes. But so there's this sort of the pros and cons of Metamucil. So I'll tell you the pros. The good news first is that it tends to make your bowel movements more regular in several different ways, meaning more predictable about when you'll have them, which for someone who's worried about bowel movements, that might kind of be a nice thing. It makes them, if you have loose stool, it'll make it more solid, right? So it's a better bowel movement. And if you have really constipated poops, it'll make it softer. So it just kind of works to bulk things up and bring everything together. So either way, it gets things regular, more in the middle range. That's healthier and easier to pass for you. So again, that means like wiping will be a little easier. The other thing, it sort of coats the poop so that it really does come out more easily and cleaner. So sometimes, if you've ever had one of those one wipe wonders where you wipe one time and it's clean, you stand a much greater chance of having that when you're taking something like Metamucil. Way more likely. So it sounds like a miracle. There's a downside to it. Well, one of the downsides, I guess, is the Metamucil itself, or the product itself. It may not taste great. I think it tastes fine, but some people don't like it, or they think it's gritty or something. So there's that, which is like kind of probably not a huge deal. But the other thing is that I said it helps you become more regular, so it helps you get on like a rhythm. But the way that works is that when you have the feeling that you have to have a bowel movement when you're on a product like this, you really feel it. Because they say it's a bulking agent. Like it bulks up your stool, it makes it a little, kind of makes it swell. So you feel it. It feels like the normal pressure of a bowel movement, but it's much stronger. It doesn't mean you have to race to the bathroom. It's not like diarrhea where you go, oh my gosh, like I'm going to poop right now, I have to run. You can still feel this really strong urge to poop with Metamucil and take a flight, take a class, watch a movie, you can do all that stuff. It'll just be uncomfortable for a while, and then it will sort of pass or go away a little bit. But the thing I like about this is that for people who like to avoid pooping, which is a lot of people with OCD, they want to poop in their bathroom at home, for example, so maybe you don't like to poop at work or out at a restaurant if you need to. This product makes it harder to do that. It gives you a little more incentive to go when you need to go, which is really, really good for your system. It's really good to go when you have to go. So I feel like it's perfect because it's sort of this trade-off where you can sort of expect to have cleaner bowel movements and have them be easier, less pushing and all that. But the trade-off is you're going to have to go when you go. I mean, it's going to be a little bit, less comfortable or more uncomfortable to hold it. Okay, so we've talked about some of these things, but I guess maybe I'll just make a couple of comments. So the medical conditions bullet point is here to remind me just to say that there really are medical conditions that make this stuff more challenging for people, and that you do need to keep that in mind and talk to your doctor and be honest with everybody about what's happening. But even when you have a legitimate medical condition that makes this more challenging, I don't think there's really ever going to be a medical condition that says a roll of toilet paper is the solution. The doctors aren't going to say, well, you're just going to have to spend an hour in there. Sorry. That's really not it. If there's a medical condition, things that they'll tell you to do is probably to spend less time in there. Usually more time on the toilet is going to make problems like this worse. And if it is a situation where you really can't get off the toilet because of a medical problem, you really have reason to see the doctor because you're probably very dehydrated if you have that loose, watery stool all the time. It's not good for you. So think of this as like these are things you're going to have to work with people on and to talk about. And if you're in treatment for OCD and your therapist isn't sort of hearing you and you're saying, I have medical problems and they're calling it OCD, then you guys have to, I would say, like find a way to compromise where you go, like you have a consult or you do some kind of medical evaluation that then you guys can talk about. If you've already had that, they might be sort of pushing you to say, okay, we've done this, so we know what the medical part is, now I want to push you on OCD. But if you haven't sort of gotten this issue cleared up, and you really think it's important, then you should do it. Go see the doctor. Okay, this one, prolapse rectum. Have you guys ever heard of this term? about it until I came to the OCDI, and it's pretty important thing to talk about. Prolapse rectum is from, well, we can relate to a few things, but if you push really hard during a bowel movement, it's sort of like if you have a sock that gets pulled inside out, right? So like if this is your rectum and you're pushing, the rectum kind of goes from being inside to outside. It's sort of like that feeling of when your anus flares a little bit when you're pooping. That's sort of very normal. That's part of relaxing the sphincters to allow yourself to go. But if you push and push and push, it sort of keeps going and it can like come outside of the body. Most of the time, I think what happens is after you're done pushing, everything comes back in with you. But if that's happening, that's a really like telltale sign that you're pushing way too hard, and that those muscles have gotten weak enough that they're like coming out. Sometimes it gets to the point where the rectum is sort of like, prolapsed, and you're done pooping, and it won't go back in. So if you haven't heard this strategy, I want to at least teach you guys how to help that go back in for two reasons. One, because when it's prolapsed, if you're trying to clean it, it's going to cause a lot of irritation and it's very challenging. So it'd be better for you to try to move everything back inside and then clean yourself if you can. But you may or may not be willing to do that. So this would be the trick. You can do it on the floor, I suppose, but things that you'll read will say use your bed or something like that because it's a softer surface. But all you would do is this. Lay down and you pull your knees up to your chest, like this. And that makes it a little bit easier for it to return to normal. I think this is really important to teach. It's really a survival skill because if you don't want to talk about even like what your poop looks like or how many times you go, if it's sort of an uncomfortable topic, then who's going to want to talk about a prolapse rectum when you think, I don't know what this is, or it's weird, or what's happening to you? But it's really not. It's not that uncommon. It's not like sort of a something to be worried about, but it's something you should talk to your doctor about, because I think you can also do some exercises to strengthen the muscle and sort of get some tone back so it doesn't happen as often. But if I can only imagine, if this was something that happened on every bowel movement, then using the toilet in public is going to be a little bit more daunting task. So it means you're going to avoid doing it, which means the poop's going to be more dehydrated, so you're not going where you need to go, so more water gets extracted, then you have to push more the next time you go, more likely to have prolapse, right? So it keeps going and going. It's better to kind of let your body get on a rhythm and do what it's doing. Okay, this is very high tech. You can see the cover box. This is part of a survey that I did a few years ago to figure out how many wipes people generally use when they have a bowel movement. So what I did with this scale was this is perfectly white. This one has a little bit of red on it. I wanted it to look like there was bleeding, but this kind of threw off the scale a little bit because it didn't really fit. But then it was like a little tiny thing, smudge, a little more, and then a lot. These are simulated, by the way. These are actual food samples. Simulated wiping samples, and I asked people, like, choose the number that most closely resembles where you start on the first wipe, then choose the number that most resembles where you finish, and how many wipes total from start to finish. How'd you get from point A to point B? And this was over, I think I asked people over the last 2 weeks, think about the average poop you've had. So let's do, I'll slowly move across the screen. Let's start with 7, and let's just hear like applause for if you start at number 7, okay? So, no applause for 7? is pick the number where you usually start. What does the paper look like after your first wipe?
Well, it depends though,
Yeah,
because
depends on.
Yeah. So,
what we're dealing with.
So think about the last week and sort of think of an average, and then we'll see. No brave clappers out there.
6 or 7 maybe? There's no lucky winners. All right, so it sounded like something in here. That's more fun to do when there's a huge auditorium. So somewhere in here is where people tend to say they start. So far you're kind of matching the data. And then as far as where do you end, let's try it for where you end. Start at 7. You should all be applauding for this one. That is definitely the best video. But this tends to be the actual place where, on average, people were ending. So this was a survey of, well, the sort of staff at those EI and residents at those EI. So I was going to say OCD and non-OCD, but we don't know how many of the staff could have OCD. So, this was very, very enlightening, I would say, because I thought that this was my goal. And if I wasn't getting to this one, I kind of thought there was something wrong with me. So I need to change what I'm eating, I'm not wiping properly, something's going on. But after doing this survey, it was humbling because I was like, oh no, this is like harder to do than what I thought. Like it makes sense to me now because I've been doing this for a while, but it was so funny to think, like, how did I ever think that I should be expecting to have perfectly clean toilet paper, knowing the consistency of food, and knowing that part of my body and all this stuff, it just doesn't seem realistic, but nonetheless, that's sort of the standard that we set. So this might be shocking to some of you, or really disappointing to think that this isn't a realistic goal, but I hope that it comes with some relief that if there's a faint smudge on your toilet paper, you're probably done. So now we have the light wiping technique, which, by the way, you can do 2 or 3 times. It's not really going to do anything to you because there's not much pressure there. So those are like 3 good light wipes that will remove most of the stuff. And then go in maybe with 2 more wipes with a little more pressure, maybe 3. And you could probably take a habit that's been a full roll because you have a messy bowel movement. You could probably reduce that down to like 6 or 7 wipes almost overnight if you try this technique. It comes with some anxiety. Changing any of these habits has been really hard to do. But if you spend your life in there, not only when you're having the bowel movement, but in here when you're between bowel movements, thinking about the next one, then it's worth a try. Okay, so then, for any of you who are out there going, I don't believe this data. I mean, this wasn't a terribly scientific study. But I just want to remind you about things you already know that might help you connect with the reality that you are a mammal that poops, and you're always going to have to poop. Why do we have so many names for poop and so many jokes about poop? You know, why do we have this thing about wearing clean underwear? People say, you know, wear clean underwear, or do you guys know what skid marks are? Oops. Do you know what this term means? Do you have other names for it? Dirty underwear.
Dirty underwear. I've heard some really funny things, but so what are skid marks?
When it's not quite clean, then it kind of gets on your underwear.
Yes. It's poop in the underwear. It's a stain in your underwear, and we know about this because it's very common. We joke about things that people can relate to.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not a very funny joke. So we have jokes about poop because everybody does it, and we
we know it's kind of uncomfortable. And the skid mark thing, there's a name for that because it's everywhere. It happens all the time. So going back to this idea, sort of like, well, yeah, it's great when that happens. It's sort of nice, easy day, right? But the reality is that life is going to include skid marks, and it's worth having skid marks to go live your life, really. These are some links. I can send you guys this stuff if you want. This bathroom survey is really interesting. It's like almost, I can't remember, like 2 million people have taken this, and it gives you like numbers about how many people, like we talked about crumpling versus folding the toilet paper. It'll tell you how many people do that. Lots of other interesting things about the thing. All right, these are some of the techniques. You might have talked about most of them, but so how do you break out of this cycle? It's really easy to get caught up in your rituals while you're pooping because it's a private place where people aren't supposed to bother you. So if you were washing your hands like crazy at the sink in a public restroom, and people walk in, like there's that sort of embarrassment where people don't do their rituals in front of other people. You at least scale them back. But if you're behind closed doors and there's nobody there like waiting on you, you can really get out of control. So the reading aloud was the strategy for am I pushing too hard. Pooping in public is just always a good thing to do because it gives you that ability to go when you need to go. So that's something to practice. And you also, hopefully that adds a little bit of that social element where you might be willing to reduce the amount of wiping you do because you know people are hearing you pulling off more toilet paper. Setting limits, that's an obvious one. And the limits that I would set would be the limit I would set would be shooting for this goal and trying to get there in about 5 to 7 wipes if you can. But, you know, it's not a perfect system. But that would sort of be the limit, right? Say, well, I'm going to try 3 of these light wipes, and then maybe I'll wipe no more than 5 more times, and that'll be it. Doing a dry run can be helpful depending on what is bothering you about using the bathroom. So what I do with this is you do every step of the bowel movement except the bowel movement itself without pooping. So you would go into the bathroom, you'd actually take your pants down, you'd sit down on the toilet. You could even let your sort of relax your sphincter and let those muscles relax a little bit. Do one very light wipe, stand up, and leave. If you do that, so you kind of practice a lot of the stuff that people don't like, sitting on the toilet, the wiping part, the letting the muscles relax will kind of feel like you're not clean. It's even, I think, helpful sometimes to do that without wiping, so that if you're someone who wants to be perfectly clean, you've sort of made yourself feel incomplete in a way, and you're giving yourself practice at feeling incomplete without going to the trouble of having a bowel movement where you could get stuck in there wiping. So it's incompleteness and the feeling of getting it to feel right when you're done pooping. If that's your problem, then doing a dry run can offer you an opportunity to practice it over and over and over and over again, even in a single day where you wouldn't have that many bowel movements to practice it for real. You know what I mean? So that would help you make faster gains. Changing your technique, I was kidding about wiping, making somebody wipe with their left hand versus their right. But that actually, things like that, anything to change your technique could be helpful if you're someone who's very meticulous and you try to get it just right. Because it would make it harder for you to do it the right way if you change the system. Here's my 3 wipes you out. The wipe scale we talked about. Following what the sort of normal medical advice would be about stuff, like drinking lots of water, exercising is good for poop, but it's scary for people to exercise, then I might have to poop. I mean, that's the whole point.
But if you want total control over your system, sometimes people avoid that. So an exercise will help you have better bowel movements. Don't avoid that. Metamucil, all those things are good. And the last one is be human, not perfect. Just try to remember that this is not something that you're supposed to have total control over, and something that everybody's doing, even Obama and Romney. Maybe right now. Posture. Do you want to have, I'll give you one quick lesson on posture. I forgot about this. You've heard of that famous sculpture, the thinker? This one doing this. This is pretty good pooping position. Leaning forward, elbows on your knees, something like that. This would be even better. But most of us don't have a toilet that's designed for this kind of thing. Although some people have said that they do that. They just do this, believe it or not, on the toilet. So when you're in this position, you are taking that curve in your rectum, and you're just sort of straightening it out just a little bit, and it can make it easier for the poop to come out. So if you're someone that has been trying to be complete, I need my toilet back, sorry. If you're worried about being complete, getting everything out, sometimes people do stuff like they start bouncing, or they do other stuff, or they're doing this, right? All of these things work. If you've had kids and they're constipated, they'll tell you to give them a little abdominal massage, right? So it works. You can mechanically help things through the system. But you know, that can become sort of like an excessive focus of things. So if you're thinking, oh, I'll sit up straight and I'll practice these different positions, just know that this tends to be a good position. And then the rest of it is sort of up to you if you want to bounce around and do that. That's fine. Okay, I think that's it.
I want to apologize for coming so late. I'm going to ask this. Were you mostly focusing on constipation issues due to medication, or was there OCD, dirtiness, and contamination part of this? Are you an OCD doctor?
Yes, we actually, what would you guys say? We didn't talk much about contamination. We really talked more about just the ins and outs of poop, how to do it, how to poop.
Why? Is it from an OCD perspective? I have an OCD question.
Well, we'll ask your OCD question.
Okay, well, like another prep question. I don't know how you are at dream interpretation, but I'm really, really glad I made it here. I was caught at the polls for like an hour, but I'm in a support group, and it's really interesting. More than a couple of people that are diagnosed the same as me, have the same dreams as me. And if I were to tell you that a lot of those dreams center around toilet facilities that are broken up, or like cracked floors and walls, and toilets that were very unsanitary in every way you could possibly imagine. And the inability to walk in, the inability to touch things. From a dream interpretation standpoint, do you have anything to say about that?
I don't, only because I have no training in dream interpretation.
Should I ask that first?
Yeah, but
Thank you.
yes.
Okay, we've been scratching our heads for a while. And these are people without contamination issues at all. So those are interesting.
Well, thanks so much, you guys. We have to leave the room, but if you have questions, I'll just be right outside for a few minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason.